In this problem, we're going to be finding sine inverse of cosine of 5 pi over 4. When we start this problem, we always want to work on what's on the innermost part of our functions, which is this cosine of 5 pi over 4. And then whatever result we get from that, we will then plug that into sine inverse to evaluate this entire problem. So let's start with this cosine of 5 pi over 4. When we've dealt with this in the past, the first thing that we've had to do is to find a reference angle. Rather than memorize every single unit circle value, if we just memorize the values in quadrant 1, then we can use reference angles to find the rest of them. So, cosine of 5 pi over 4, we're going to start by drawing out 5 pi over 4. So, if we start here, we've gone a distance of pi over 2. So we need to go a bit further. If we continue all the way to our third quadrantal angle, we've gone a distance of pi. That's still not quite 5 pi over 4. But if we went all the way to our fourth quadrantal angle, we would have 3 pi over 2. That's a bit more than 5 pi over 4. Remember, you can always check by finding a least common denominator. If we multiplied 3 pi over 2 by 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom, we would get 6 pi over 4, which is just a bit further than 5 pi over 4. So that tells us that 5 pi over 4 is in quadrant 3. And in quadrant 3, we know that cosine is going to be negative. So cosine of any angle is less than 0. Which tells us that if we move over to this cosine of 5 pi over 4, that's going to be equal to the negative cosine of, and now we want to find our reference angle of 5 pi over 4 in quadrant 1. So remember, whenever you're in quadrant 3, you take your angle and you subtract 180 degrees, or in this case, pi from it, which again means that we're going to need a least common denominator. So we'll put our pi over 1, and our LCD in this case is 4. So we'll multiply the top and the bottom by 4 to get 5 pi over 4 minus 4 pi over 4 is equal to pi over 4. Remember, you just keep the denominator the same, which is 4, and you subtract the numbers on top. 5 pi minus 4 pi is just pi. So cosine of 5 pi over 4 is equal to the negative cosine of just pi over 4. And now this is one of our unit circle values in quadrant 1. Cosine of pi over 4 is equal to the square root of 2 divided by 2. And that's all going to be multiplied by this negative, so we get the negative square root of 2 over 2. Which brings us back to the original problem. All the work we did was just to find what was inside of our sine inverse, which means to keep solving this problem, we now need to find sine inverse of the negative square root of 2 over 2. And again, when you're thinking of inverse functions, always remember that we're just trying to find what angle theta was plugged into sine to give us a value of negative square root 2 over 2. So we know what angle when plugged into sine gives us the square root of 2 over 2. That's just pi over 4. It's the same thing as cosine of pi over 4. But because of this negative, remember that sine inverse of any value x has to be less than or equal to pi over 2, but greater than or equal to negative pi over 2. It has to be like this because it has to be an inverse function. In order to be an inverse, it has to pass the horizontal line test, and being in this range of values is the only way that it can. So, if we plugged pi over 4 into sine, we would get just the positive square root of 2 over 2. We don't want that though, we want the negative square root of 2 over 2, which means we need the negative angle. The value between negative pi over 2 and 0. That gives us a negative sine value. So all we have to do in this case is just make this a negative angle. So in all, sine inverse of cosine of 5 pi over 4 is equal to negative pi over 4. And as you begin to progress through these problems more and more, you'll come to realize that all of this work will be something that you'll mainly do in your head. You don't want to write all this out for every single one of these problems. You'll start to get used to just keeping track of this ASTC without actually having to write it down. And you'll also be able to quickly deal with these reference angles without actually doing this conversion of rewriting it as the negative cosine of pi over 4 and so on. So keep practicing your unit circle values and keep practicing some more examples like this.